start working through this. I was just saying that I'm not certain how many people will be on the call today because we unfortunately had to move our monthly standing meeting up one day. So I'm sorry if that kept some people from being able to attend today, but it could not be helped. So we'll go ahead and get going.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hey, Jeff, before we get started for real quick, on a separate note, we might need to talk a little bit offline on a couple of non-signal related items that I need to talk to you about. So you've been on my list of people to call for a while, so just FYI.
Me?
Yeah.
Am I in trouble?
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay, so we are having a little bit of technical difficulty this morning. I had a PowerPoint presentation, and maybe one of you probably decided you probably have enough PowerPoint and decided I don't want to see this anymore. So I'm gonna walk you through it and keep it fairly high level because I don't have we don't have the presentation to show you or at least can't connect it. So let me give you some quick updates. First and foremost, on the grant, we have talked to DWR on the implementation grant. An agreement is expected in early May to arrive for both the Tule and the Tulare Lake subbasins. That once that agreement is in place, that will be $7.6 million for both subbasins each. And both of them have multiple projects that are going to be starting right away. As far as South Fork is concerned, South Fork. I'm in the wrong meeting. It all blends into one. I apologize. As far as Tri-County is concerned, that means we're going to be starting the design for the Allensworth project as well as the CEQA documentation for the Allensworth project. And just a couple of quick items in both subbase, or in the Tulare Lake subbase, I should say. It also includes the money for the new model update, and it includes a native yield study, which is essentially looking at how much water is available in Tulare Lake and what that sustainable yield is going to be, basically start to identify. That's the first step towards coming up with an allocation in Tulare Lake as well. So I think the Tulare Lake subbasin at least has been a lot more focused now on realizing that they need to have this in place, and that is going to be funded through the grant. So I think that's an important step. From Tri-County standpoint, in our allocation that we did for Tri-County, we essentially took all of the water that was available in Tulare Lake and in the sustainable yield that's in the GSP, in the existing GSP, and just divided that by the total acreage and came up with a value. And if any of you remember, that's about 0.44 acre feet per acre. And that number may or may not change depending on this native yield study that's going to be conducted there. So just want to at least give everybody a heads up that has an possibility that it may affect our allocations as well for Tri-County. It may go up. Yeah. So it's not. I don't want to. It may not change at all. So just FYI, and please, anybody as I go through any of these updates, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask.
Have we discussed any kind of timeline for the native yield study?
No, we haven't at Tulare Lake.
I didn't think.
Yeah, there isn't a timeline just yet. Obviously, it needs to be well in place before the GSP update in 2025.
Right.
There is some question about whether we have to have a model completed in order to do that native yield study, and we don't feel that that's necessary. I think we have enough information based
grant funding, they'll have to be completed by 2025,
They ha-
end of 2024?
Yeah, they have to, the last invoice has to go out by the middle of 2025. June of 2025 is the date of the last invoice for the project.
Hey, this is Jeff, it's kind of side related. I think that this grant approach of the 7.6, allocating it to the GSAs without a competitive bid requirement, without a match, minimum match requirement is a great approach. But I'm wondering what you think, particularly Deanna with the Aqua, your colleagues there. I think the state's going to get asked to cough up a lot of money, and they should to allocate. It just seems like it would be really good to praise DWR for this approach and encourage them that as they consider more grant programs, that they use something more along the lines of this than some of the other grant approaches they've taken.
Yeah, that is a very good point, and that is exactly what we've tried to do. I was on a call with the department. It was, I don't know, were you on that call too? Where they kind of, it was said that it would be doubtful that process would happen again at the next round.
Yeah.
But we're still hopeful that you're right. Maybe with some cajoling, we could get them to go through the same process. It was easier, and I thought we did a good job internally within the subbasins, picking projects and moving forward. It was a lot smoother than going through the process with each of the subbasins and then trying to convince the state on top of that. So it was a much smoother process, especially with the timelines we have. The timelines for these grant processes are very short, and so that extra layer, I hope that we don't have it, but.
It just seems like some organized communication, that would be sent to DWR and also the legislature about this particular approach to allocating money would be. I think they're going to be discussing this over as soon as the governor comes out with a May revise. I know there's multiple letters that are being sent in to the legislature and the governor by water agencies across the state asking for, billions of dollars. And this approach is one that I think really works for the Sigma requirements and the GSAs that are under the gun right now.
So, Jeff, just to tag along with what Deanna said, round 2 of this grant, of the implementation grant, the way it's currently written, today, at least in its current format, is back to a competitive bid. And then you got to turn in competitive applications. So we've mentioned this numerous times to several folks up in DWR that we really did like the way the round 1 was handled. And we're hoping that they'll continue to do that in the future. And so, your thoughts are appreciated on that. We definitely plan on following up on that.
Just wondering, Rusty's on and he's got a long history of watching this stuff work, as does David. I wonder if there's any advice that he might have for everybody on how to bend the needle on this one.
Well, they're going to have a lot of money, and they're going to be looking for projects that are shelf ready, and the more state of readiness and the higher you score all those kinds of things, the better chance you're going to have. I mean, I don't think there's any big mystery about it. We can weigh in politically, and we will get people to write letters of support, key people. That always helps. But I that's what we do. So David, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the thing that I would do is I would not overlook including Secretary of Resources Crowfoot, so that, the complement goes all the way down the chain there, from Crowfoot down to Carla Nemeth. And might even want to include Eileen Selbeck at State Water Board. Just make it inclusive and say, that you came up with a really great idea, and we encourage you to, continue this kind of format into the future. And the qualifications should be, as Rusty said, shelf-ready projects that are ready to go. Considering that we are in a drought and everything has to be accelerated in order to meet the impacts of the drought.
Yeah, and then buttress that with letters of support from all the assemblymen, senators, congressmen, local members of the Board of Supervisors in the area that would benefit. And that's that's just dotting your I's and crossing your T's politically.
Yeah, I would imagine, Deanna, that Aqua's legislative committee would probably really be a good keen ally on this idea.
Yes, and I actually have a meeting today with their leadership program, so it'll be the leadership of Aqua and key staff members, and I'll be sure to raise this as an issue for our region that we want elevated. So,
who's the actual decision maker on the grant?
the Department of Water Resources.
But who? There's gonna be one guy.
I don't know internally.
Well, they get approved, the grants actually do get approved by Carla Nemeth, but I'm forgetting her first name. Her last name's West. She's one of the people that is in the process portion of the grants, but there's a number of them in that area. They get divvied up, and Paul Goslin, who's in charge of the GSAs, they go through, his hands, and then ultimately Carla Nemeth, I think, has to sign off on them. But the worker bees are all in a grants division there at DWR.
So in the interest of time, we do have to wrap up this meeting at 11, before 11, about 5 minutes to 11, because.
Meredith has a quick question
Oh.
for you in chat.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
So she wants to know if the native yield study will also look at moving pumping credits across the GS.
Doubt it.
I think that's probably separate.
Yeah, Maris, will probably be separate from the native yield study. Moving the credits is gonna be more of a, once we get the allocation and a policy decision. And I think the study itself is just to get everyone to agree on what that native yield actually is, and frankly, whose water is whose, right? I mean, that's probably gonna be the most difficult part of that discussion.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. That makes sense.
Well, you've got a yield though based on that area that you've already said, like 0.44.
Yeah.
And then, so somebody else has another one, but you have to come up with some type of system to move it, whether it's a payback 5-10 years, or you have to have some kind of transfer.
Because now we're in the Tulare Lake subbasin, this is the study.
Right, so you have to have a payback.
You have to know how much water there is to move around before you can set up any type of policy to move that water. So this is the basic ground level, figure out what water is available over all acres, basically, the native, and then you can start working on policy between the GSAs, but without that study.
There are a lot of people asking about doing projects, and investing in things, and they need to know that answer fairly soon, because otherwise they don't know, is it worthwhile investing in something, and they'll never be able to transfer or move credit.
Right.
It's definitely a problem.
Yeah. And not just here, it's all over.
But that means that there should be an acceleration by us on that native yield project, not till the end,
I agree.
2025.
Yeah, Yeah, no, I agree, Mark, and our view is that this needs to be done now or sooner, and the updates to the model can take a longer period.
Right.
Okay, so again, like I said, in the interest of time, because we do need to wrap up on time today, let me keep moving down the agenda. Ren's not here. So Kathy, do you want to talk about the DOC conservation of block grant?
Yeah, just very quickly, because I know you guys are on a time constraint. The block grant with the Department of Conservation, it's $50 million. The Pixley GSA has taken the lead and has applied for $10 million for the block grant. Tri-County and Eastern Thule and Pixley are the three GSAs that are partners, along with several other partners, including UC Merced, which will be doing some monitoring. So the piece for us is we're going to be on a call where it's been submitted, and Deanna and I, and Amir, you're going to join us. We're going to be on a call, an interview with Department of Conservation. They're interviewing all of the project proponents individually, and so they've produced a PowerPoint, and we're going to give a presentation. Deanna's going to give a quick presentation about what this repurposing grant means to Tri-County. And basically, we're going to be getting some funding and some monitoring through UC Merced on the Allensworth Recharge and Flood Management Project, so the one that you guys have put up for DWR. Right now, the budget, we're looking at $10 million, and as we've called it, it's a little bit squishy. We're not really sure where all the money is going, but
We're trying.
implementing land repurposing projects, it looks like almost $4.3 million is kind of earmarked for that. There's going to be some planning, and I'm the former watershed coordinator, and so I'm kind of on this committee by default, and it's kind of going through the DOC watershed coordinator. So I've been kind of the advocate for Tri-County, since I do a lot of work in this area with you. And so I've been following this and working with Deanna. I know you're super, super busy, but want to make sure that Tri-County is in the middle of the planning process. Since you guys are looking, you're one of the GSAs that's really actively looking at land repurposing. So there's like 6 items in here. They're going to be doing planning for land repurposing. They're going to be doing project development and permitting. They're going to implement projects. And then a big piece is some outreach, looking at reaching out to the communities, which I think is really interesting, some of the things they're proposing, building capacity in the region, and also monitoring. So those are kind of the 6 areas that they're looking at in the grant. But for us, for Tri-County, we're really looking at doing some monitoring of the benefits of, with UC Merced, the benefits to the community of Allensworth in the recharge. And I think that project is right along the lines of this. So
And it might even have some dollars in there for habitat restoration, either on adjacent property to the reservoir we're planning or along the reservoir we're planning, so within.
What's Pixley's repurposing?
well, we've got the Caponero project, and we've done the Lower Deer Creek watershed plan, which really hasn't been completed yet. So I'm also on the land trust over there. So the land trust just got $4.7 million to purchase Caponero, the old Deer Creek Dairy, and we're going to be going in and restoring that to
The new dairy?
yeah, no. Upland habitat, to scrub habitat, and it's the Bureau of Reclamation that's funding it. So, but I think, I really look at Tri-County really benefiting from, participating in this.
It's a benefit to participate, being pragmatic about it. These early dollars, likely will not leverage ground out of production, but there will be planning dollars which will help the region to plan on how to leverage these dollars as they come and work with landowners that are interested in these programs that will be designed. So it's early in the process. I see a lot more money coming to this area in grants. for that purpose as we move forward, so that's where we are.
Kathy, do you see any of this money towards, conversion for, like, other than Habitat? Is any of it, you know, for, like, Sequodocs or things like that for solar?
Definitely, yes. I think we need to be looking at the wide range of land repurposing. It's not just, I know TNC and Audubon are two of the NGOs that are really leading the charge, but you know, Habitat ideally would be the way to go, but I think there's it's looking at land repurposing for all sorts of things. But the ultimate benefit is to reduce groundwater extraction. I think that's really a subsidence and for you to implement your GSP, and that's probably the main thing, is looking at it from the water. And we've talked about this in this meeting. It'll be interesting because I think they're going to ask the question. I expect DOC to ask a question of, well, how much water are you going to save through this program? Because $10 million, it doesn't go a long ways, but I think they want to see some measurable results, I would imagine, in terms of how it's going to benefit the groundwater sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, by getting way out of my league here, or out of my comfort, or, you know, out of my lane here, but it strikes me that, I mean, Habitat is important, but it doesn't create jobs.
Right.
You know, the way some of these other things.
Jobs.
Yeah,
You don't have to do anything to reverse this ground to scrub.
Oh, I know. It just comes back.
Just quit putting water on it.
Oh, man. But I think that's part of the planning process. That's why I want to see Tri-County in the middle of that number one priority of looking at repurposing planning. What's going to work for the communities?
Right.
Then there's a huge piece of ties at communities. And right now, Pixley has a lot of projects. We have the Allensworth project, and I think there's just we just need to have a voice in this process.
Yeah. Any questions for Kathy on the conservation grant, the land repurposing grant? Anybody, any additional information that or any thoughts on anything that Kathy should consider as she's, you know, kind of going, Kathy and Deanna, as they're going into this interview this later this morning, in about a half hour. All right. Anything on Basin Safe?
I don't think we have an update on Basin Safe. I would just ask if there's anybody on the call that has a question regarding their Basin Safe account that they would like to ask, and we'd be happy to try and answer that.
All right, we'll keep moving. The water counting policy and our discussions with Tom Harder, and I think we mentioned in the last meeting that the board had put that on hold, Tom's contract, to retain him, and frankly, to be honest, it probably wouldn't have mattered anyways, because Tom and his team are completely right now wrapped up in the response to comments to DWR for the incomplete determination letter that the Tule Subbasin got. And so he would not have had any opportunity to even remotely work on this. So we're still trying to get Tom's attention, and then as we get it approved by the board at the next meeting.
Yeah, I don't know that it'll be I would say, will likely be, we may have it on the agenda the same meeting as we approve the revised comments, or revised response. Okay, so before that, like Amir said, nobody would be able to work on it anyway. It is, all of the consultants are busy rewriting the sustainable management criteria for all of the plans, so.
Yeah. And so that is, you know, that's an ongoing issue that we're gonna work with. The land repurposing on item C, we already talked about. And then that takes us to item D, which is the GSP update or the response to the department's, DWR's comments. So like I said, I had a nice little PowerPoint presentation prepared, but it's it doesn't, no problem. Again, just a quick reminder to everybody, it was an incomplete determination, so we have until July 27th to get our updated GSP back to the department. We've had some initial meetings with them as both Tri-County and Tulare Lake. Four Creeks and Tom Harder's group are working on the Tule Subbasin's coordination agreement, so that there is an update to the coordination agreement that basically lays out how everyone should approach their response. We just received the technical memorandum yesterday from Tom, and it kind of lays out. So I'm going to go briefly over that. Like I said, we haven't had much of an opportunity to go through it in much detail, but I'm just going to talk to you guys about the overall approaches, and then as we get into it more in next month's meeting as well, we will be giving you some further details in May, and hopefully, by that point at the end of May, we'll have my hope is to have at least a draft available to Deanna to review, and she'll be well into her review by then. So we'll have a lot more to share with you next month. There were three items that were essentially discussed or identified as deficiencies by DWR. One was water levels, subsidence, and water quality. And both on the Tule and the Tulare Lake side, the consultants independently came up with very similar approaches. We were all rather pleased. There is a lot more conversations going on between all of the GSA or the subbasins now than there ever was during the GSP preparation, 2.5 years ago. So that's a good thing. I think the responses that DWR is going to get are going to be a lot more similar, and they're going to see a lot of the same type of responses. So on the water levels, one of the things that DWR identified as a deficiency is the fact that they didn't feel that our initial GSP took into account all of the beneficial uses and users of that water. And so one of the items that we're doing is that we're going through a database that's on DWR's website that identifies all the well users in this, and the database is not perfect. We on the Tulare Lake side have used the database, and we've divided it up by section. And you'll see that, there's a certain number of wells in each section, and then all of a sudden in one section, there's like 1,500 wells. You're like, yeah, that's not right. So the database is not perfect. It was developed for DWR by one of the NGOs. It is hosted by DWR, but there is a lot of information in there that still needs to be cleaned up. We don't think it identifies accurately the current active wells. So we are, as much as possible, trying to clean up that to the best that we can within the time frame that we have available to us. So you're going to see some numbers over the next month that but they're all based on the abbreviation for it is the OSCAR database that DWR has. So one of the things that Tom did is go through and identify in 2015, because 2015 is identified as the year in SGMA. We're not responsible for water levels or practice that occurred before 2015. So based on the 2015 water level, Tom identified all the wells in the Tule Subbasin by GSA, and then they identified how many of those, roughly where water levels would be, and then he looked at what the well completion is for that well, including where the pumps would be, estimated in those wells. I think he assumed that all the pumps were at the bottom of the well, and that that doesn't matter, I mean, it's probably a fair assumption. And then they went through and it said, okay, if this was the water level in 2015, everything above that, that's completed above that, is going to be either dry or not relevant to any future discussion, so we can take all those wells out. Then they went through and looked at above the Corcoran and below the Corcoran and identified how many wells could be potentially impacted, and by setting the measurable objective, the minimum threshold, and how many of those wells would go dry if we went all the way down to the minimum threshold. And for Tri-County, that was identified as 5 wells that could be potentially impacted. This is all draft. It's still an ongoing discussion, but at least it starts to give us an idea. In some of the other GSAs, it's as high as 400, over 400 wells. So the number of wells are drastically different based on the potential impact. So we're in the process of reviewing this document, and we're going to get comments back to Tom. But you can see that from a Tri-County standpoint, number of wells that are going to be impacted is fairly minimal. The other item then becomes subsidence. And so Tom went through on the subsidence. They started to identify all of the critical infrastructure. And I think that's one of the key items that DWR is looking for. In the water levels, they wanted to make sure that domestic wells were not going to be impacted, and how many of those domestic wells. And then they're looking to the GSAs to decide, what are you going to do if a domestic well is impacted? And I'm sorry, I went back to the water level thing there. I'm jumping around because I don't have my PowerPoint, so I'm trying to make sure I cover all the notes that I had. So just bear with me a little bit.
Amir, has Carter identified how many in the Tule subbasin are above the Corcoran Clay, the number of wells that are actually above the Corcoran Clay?
Yes.
Versus the total?
He did it for upper and lower aquifer.
Because the lower is irrelevant. This should all be an upper study.
Yeah, for water levels, it's
Yeah.
very focused on the upper study, because the lower aquifer is a confined aquifer.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but he has a number?
He does have a number.
What is that number?
Okay, so upper aquifer wells is 1,600, I'm rounding these off, it's 1,667, Mark, to be precise. And the number of lower aquifer wells across the entire subbasin is 2,478.
And those are active, or just
No.
the ones that are in the database?
Those are the ones in the database. That doesn't mean that they're active.
I think the number's low.
I don't know, Mark, I mean, you have so many old ones out there being abandoned, and
This does not include domestic,
Because
I think it's low.
I believe it does include domestic.
Has he initiated an actual water level average, and what did he come up with in 2015 as the benchmark?
Mark, I don't have all of that in front of me,
That would be good to know.
but I can certainly get that to you. We haven't had much chance to go through all of Tom's document, we just got it yesterday.
So currently all our measurements right now, the water level is around 250 feet. As of 2022 right now.
Yeah.
We just measured it just a few days ago. So it varies all the way down to about 600 feet. But once you hit that right at 600, you're coring into the Corcoran Clay. So I'm wondering, what's the average, Mike, what's the domestic well? How deep are they? 500 or 400?
It depends on where you are. If you're on the east, they're a lot more shallow than as you move
Yeah,
west.
we
So
want to
it's
go
really
deeper.
very
Because
dependent.
that's gonna be your benchmark to not impact the domestic well. What is the depth of the average domestic well in the Thule subdivision?
Yeah, it's right on, it's just gonna depend
Yeah.
on.
But you gotta come up with a number, because it's very easy in the summertime to hit 350, get close to 400 feet. So what are those level criterias? That's where we gotta sit down. It might be good to sit down with Harder and with, Bob. Yeah, and mark that out, because you gotta get this done, because that would be the easiest thing, set a parameter. The other one, Mike, can really help on the water quality. And those two things will, once you get that level, that's gonna help you on your subsidence.
Yeah, so hold that thought, Mark, because we are gonna get into that a little bit. I just wanna make sure everybody was aware of the approach and at least what, the Thule Subbasin and Sawyer Lake is proposing something similar in terms of going through the same database, looking at the domestic well users and how many domestic well users might be impacted at what level. And then looking at essentially coming up with a water level that's about 90% of the domestic well users. I'm not saying 10% are gonna go dry, I just wanna reiterate that, I'm not saying 10% are going dry. I'm just saying that we're using 90% because we feel like there's a minimum of a 10% level of error in this database, and that we don't wanna be held responsible for wells that were closed long ago. So we're looking at wells completed after 1980 and after 2000 and trying to get an idea of where they are. And some of the figures I would've shown you kinda show, you know, how many wells were drilled in each decade and where we can start to, you know, where's a good cutoff point for us.
But you don't have to go back past 2015.
We're not responsible for water levels previous to 2015.
So we can talk about it later, but I think if we got the Porterville info, it would give us a worst case, because a lot of it went dry.
Oh, yeah, during the drought, yeah, the 2000.
And we could actually
drought.
use those numbers and find out from some of those guys as a area.
We're not necessarily gonna set one water level for the entire
Right.
subbasin,
Yeah,
so,
that's-
No, but I mean, just a benchmark parameter.
yeah. So,
I don't know why that's so critical to them.
to the department,
Yeah.
the domestic well users and wells going dry is their number one concern, by far. So the Thule subbasin, and just to make it, you know, so we are, both sides are looking at domestic well users as at least an idea.
Sounds like they need to bring water in.
Okay, sorry, Mark, I'm gonna keep moving on, just because we wanna wrap up in the next 10 minutes here. On the subsidence, so for the water levels, by far, the issue was, you know, potential domestic well users and impacts to them, but we do have to look at everyone. You know, part of what we're also looking at on any type of program is to make sure that the person who has, you know, a domestic well that's going dry doesn't have an ag well, their own ag well that's pumping that well dry, right? So there are some things that we're trying to look at to make sure that the program is really focused on rural domestic and not necessarily someone who's causing their own problem. That also applies to water quality. On the subsidence part, the critical thing was to start to identify what we call critical infrastructure, and we wanted to look at all of the infrastructure, including, you know, roads, railroads, the high-speed rail, pipelines, canals, levees, flood control issues, aqueduct, or not aqueduct, but Frank Kern on the east and aqueduct on the west, flood bypass channels, buildings, runways, you know, everything that we could identify as critical infrastructure and then go through that and start to look at what kind of subsidence each of those facilities could actually, handle without creating a undesirable result. So we're in the process of doing that. Some of these, obviously, if a road comes down altogether, which has been happening now for decades, not much of a concern. If we've got differential settlement where one side is selling more than the other, then that's where some of the concerns could come in. The other thing too, for example, on wells, everyone whose well fails keeps pointing at and saying that's subsidence and not
Even if they're above the clay.
yeah, even if they're above the clay, right? So that's not always the case. And there may be policy issues that need to be identified and written into the plan that can handle things of that. So for example, if we're going to approve your well, maybe you need to put in some kind of compression section. That just becomes part of the well permitting process rather than policy, and makes that issue go away. So we've mitigated for it, and so that's what we're trying to come up with is values for that. We actually have a meeting on subsidence with presenting our approach with DWR on this Thursday. So we're meeting with them Thursday to say, hey, this is how we're approaching the subsidence, and get some feedback and some input from DWR on that and see if that's going to fly with them. Our approach, again, is very similar to what Kuya and a few others have already run by the department. So the nice thing about maybe going a little bit later than everyone is the department has already seen some of these items, and they have some ideas now that they don't necessarily have when they first get approached. And so we're hoping to have a very productive meeting with them. But again, if you see a common thread in all the comments that I'm making, it's very much focused on the users and uses that are affected by this, and that's become pretty clear that is what the department's really looking to make sure all of those users are addressed. On the canal side, there are mitigation measures and other things, but Tom actually went through, and when he ran the subsidence that would occur through the modeling efforts, we looked at where and how much subsidence would occur and how that would affect some of the canals. Now, in the Tule subbasin, the largest amount of subsidence that is in a large area that's going to occur is is shown on the west side, and that's where the water naturally flows anyways towards the river bottom. But there are definitely areas throughout the Tule subbasin, individual hotspots that are showing up with a much higher level of subsidence than others, and so there is some other concerns that need to be addressed in there, and all of those are outside of the Tri-County area. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation within the Tule subbasin, and make sure that those areas are properly addressed.
Mayor, picking on like the Bryant Current, if you go back to even at the 2015 levels, if you said those wasn't subsidence happening?
Yeah.
It may have been a slower rate, but it's the same issue then. So how are they going to deal with if it was already happening, trying to correct? And it's the same, other areas. I mean, I think it's just more highlighted over there right now.
Yeah, on Bryant Kern, the one thing, Mike, is that the Eastern Tule, they do have that subsidence mitigation plan and that they're implementing. So I would say that as far as the wells that are immediately surrounding Eastern Tule is doing a pretty good job of trying to move forward with a plan to implement there to address those wells. That's not to say that, subsidence is occurring other places that might affect the canal, but at least immediately, I think the Bryant Kern Canal is issues are going to be addressed through that mitigation plan. And then on the west side, on Slurry Lake side, the aqueduct in that portion of Slurry Lake that crosses the southwest Kings is such a small amount, and the department Department in their own published documents has said that subsidence is not a concern in that area. So I don't think as far as, you know, between Tulare Lake, that subsidence on the aqueduct is not a concern. It's occurring either to the north or south of that area, and it is occurring, yeah, to both those areas.
I would say on the Frank Kern, this is an ongoing discussion because Eastern Thule has, put forth a mitigation plan, a subsidence plan basically, that eliminates pumping depending on the amount of subsidence that's happening, in sections as you go away from the canal. But as you move on further into, if you move south, you go through Delana Early Mark. And Delana Early Mark, you know, they have, because on paper, they're in balance, right? Because of the investments they've made in CVP, they have water on paper that shows they're in balance. But unfortunately, there's a subsidence area through Delana Early Mark too. So there's still areas that have to be addressed that are not currently being addressed, and so we're gonna see how that plays out, but it's a concern.
But as you go through the whole subsidence analysis, really it's all water related, whether it's wells, flood control facilities, or canals, but other non-related or unrelated water facilities, roads and all that, are we aware of any differential settling or anything? High-speed rail, unless it really gets to a roller coaster type deal. I mean, is there any other impacts that we have to address on the infrastructure?
No, probably what's gonna govern, is gonna be the water facilities, Mike. I think the rest of them are on the list to be able to check off that, hey, we looked at all these users,
There's no impact.
but what's gonna probably govern for our area is going to be the water facilities.
Yeah.
We wanna make sure the flood control and conveyance facilities, and what kind of mitigation or anything else that we might need to implement for that. So,
I'll let you keep going.
I'm gonna wrap up here real quickly. So we talked about subsidence, we talked about water levels, and water quality is the last one. And essentially on water quality, we identified, some of the groundwater, areas that exceed the maximum contaminant drinking water levels, the MCL, or the water quality objectives that the state has set for groundwater quality. And those have been, those areas have been identified, and essentially, the sustainable management criteria that will be set will either be the water quality objective or the MCL, whichever one is more stringent in areas that do not exceed those values, as of 2015. And any area that exceeds that value will be the highest concentration that was noted in that area. So, for example, if naturally occurring arsenic, uranium, things of that nature, we take that into consideration. If those already exceed the water quality objectives, then we're not trying to go backwards to clean something. We're just going to say that the highest value is that's been identified is the sustainable management criteria that we're setting for that area. So we're not trying to go back and clean something up. Our responsibility on water quality is to make sure that whatever water levels we set do not make the situation worse than what we currently have, and we don't exceed these objectives by setting that water quality at, the water levels at a different height. The only thing we control is pumping. We don't control anything else, and we're not responsible for cleaning up all of these plumes. We just can't make them worse or drag them somewhere where they haven't previously been. All right, that was the 1-minute version of the water quality objective.
I heard the state soften the regs on the quality standards on the water. Domestic. Just happened.
Yeah, I haven't heard that either, Mark.
Yeah, it just happened.
Okay. Yeah, I'm surprised too.
I was told that anyway.
Oh, that's interesting, because
John Harris told me.
So, I'm gonna apologize to everybody for ending this meeting early today, but I just received a earlier this week, a request to be on the call today. They're actually interviewing the applicants for the grant, and so we didn't want to miss that opportunity to talk to the Department of Conservation about, the necessity for the grant. And, we had a scheduled Tri-County Board meeting for Thursday. It was gonna be a special meeting, but we're gonna have to reschedule. I wasn't able to get a quorum for Thursday's meeting. So look for a special board meeting. It will be a few weeks out, though. It may be, probably not till the end of May now. And, the next advisory committee meeting should be May 25th as scheduled. But everything is in flux. You know, the meetings are between consultants and attorneys and all of the different, obligations we have as we're trying to work through the revisions to the plans. The schedule is tough to keep right now, but we're gonna do everything in our power to keep the May 25th advisory committee meeting. And, maybe we'll tack that onto a board meeting. We'll see. That might actually work. We'll do it all the same day. So, anyway, do we have any more questions? Anything we can answer before we sign off? Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.